experts, warm welcome from Bangkok. I hope everyone can hear me. I have some colleagues here in the room, and I think a vast majority are joining us online from different countries, from Asia and Pacific and beyond. A very warm welcome once again to this 5-day expert group meeting on public debt and sustainable financing in Asia and the Pacific. The main purpose, essentially, of this expert group meeting is to discuss the ongoing research of two ESCAP publications. One of them, some of you may are already familiar with, Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific. This year, the theme of that research is Rethinking Public Debt for Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And our second report will be, under progress, is Financing for Development. Current issue is number 5. This year, the theme is the rise of sustainable finance in Asia and the Pacific, how to move forward. I am privileged to actually have joined by a very senior panel of experts, which we'll be discussing after the opening session from 10 to 12 Bangkok time. But before that, let's start with the basic proceedings. Let me invite Deputy Executive Secretary of United Nations Economic and Social Commission of Asia and the Pacific, Kaveh Zahidi, to share some welcome remarks. Kaveh, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hamza, and good morning, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Special acknowledgement also that we have online our former Executive Secretary, Dr. Akhtar. So it's delightful to reconnect. Really a very warm welcome to all of you to the expert group meeting on public debt and sustainable financing in Asia and the Pacific. All of us, I think, as we start this meeting, are aware of one sort of inconvenient truth, and that is that our region of Asia Pacific is simply not on track to achieve any of the sustainable development goals by 2030. So the region is underachieving, and not only is it underachieving, but it's also underinvesting in the sustainable development goals. Even before the pandemic hit, ESCAP estimated that on average, additional investments of around 1.5 trillion per year, or about 5% of GDP, were needed for developing Asia Pacific to achieve the SDGs. Investments, frankly, that seemed out of reach of many of our Asia Pacific countries, even before the pandemic, and more so now. Now, of course, as well as the very high human costs of the pandemic also considerably worsened the economic situation of countries in the region of Asia Pacific. In particular, public debt levels have risen sharply since the onset of the pandemic, reaching the highest levels since 2000 last year in nearly 1/3 of the region's economies. And to add to the challenges, of course, we now have the war in Ukraine, which has disrupted economic recovery, increasing uncertainty and dampening near-term economic prospects. Prices are on the rise. Prices of food, fuel, and other key commodities all have gone up sharply. And inflation continues to rise. And at the same time, monetary tightening across the world is further increasing government borrowing costs and putting public debt sustainability at risk. And all of this with the quite frightening backdrop of climate change. Asia Pacific, as you all know, is home to large populations highly prone to drought, floods, rising sea levels, the increasing impacts of climate change. The region also accounts for about half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions and has not yet managed to decouple growth from emissions. The issues of ensuring a just energy transition, as well as, in a way, the broader climate justice, remain critical. So it's in this very difficult context, in these very difficult conditions, that countries are reeling from one crisis to the next, that we're discussing policy solutions and ideas that can help countries not just resume their economic recovery, but also to get on track to achieving the broader sustainable development goals. And doing all of this in a manner that addresses public debt sustainability concerns. So that's one of the purposes of this mega expert group meeting that the colleagues have organized, because we're going to be exploring what are the best policy options for strengthening national fiscal positions while at the same time protecting investments in healthcare, in education, and in social protection, all of which will be so vital if indeed countries are to deliver on their sustainable development goal aspirations. We're also going to be looking at the policy pathways on the multilateral front, such as for debt service suspension or restructuring. But we do so with the awareness that, in a way, kicking the can down the road may result in just repeated debt distress and prolonged macroeconomic stagnation. We've seen this before. And as part of all of this, we're also going to be revisiting public debt assessment, especially keeping in view the mounting post-COVID debt and the public investment requirements of the 2030 agenda, that balancing act that countries are facing. And because of all of that, the upcoming ESCAP Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific in 2023 is going to try to propose an alternative, maybe we call it an augmented public debt sustainability assessment, in which all of these additional spending needs for the SDGs will be considered as an integral part of actually analyzing the long-term public debt sustainability. Now, we know that not all is bad news. There are positive signs that countries in our region are investing in the needed SDG transition. Over the past few years, we've seen financing flows in support of climate action or sustainable development in Asia and the Pacific, all increasing exponentially. This is both finance that is specifically used for sustainability purposes, as well as finance that incorporates ESG risks. In that context, green, social, and sustainability bonds alone in the Asia-Pacific region reached around $200 billion in 2021. And all of this market is still holding strong in 2022, despite the adverse economic trends. Change, in a way, is happening, but of course, it is not happening fast enough. Our forthcoming publication, Sustainable Finance, Bridging the Gap in Asia and the Pacific, focuses on a roadmap for policymakers, regulators, and the private sector to confront many of these cascading challenges. The report acknowledges that while countries need to do more to develop investable opportunities, a shift is also needed from investors and project owners. While risks, of course, are serious in terms of local currency, in terms of sovereign risk, and of course, climate risk that we've just touched on, investors and businesses need to shift their expectations to incorporate a rate of return that prices in the cost of climate resilience. Finally, it's important to recognize that what is needed and what we're going to be talking about during these 5 days is actually a much more systemic or systems approach. Asset owners or project developers need to price in sustainability risk when building their project pipelines. Investors should recognize that these are stronger, more robust pipelines with a different profile of returns, and their investment committees need to accommodate a new rate of return that is climate priced. Regulators and policymakers, in turn, need to coordinate across government, ensure that policies and regulations are well designed, convergent with global norms, and appropriately implemented and, of course, enforced. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very clear that we have our work cut out for us. But at the same time, to some degree, we are energized by historic net zero and other commitments of our countries and some of the positive signs from our region. But of course, we want to do more. So we ask you, the distinguished group of experts in attendance today, online in the room, leaders from the public sector, from central banks, financial industries, multilateral agencies, academia, and business. We ask you all, tell us what more our region can do. How can we ensure debt sustainability and sustainable development are not working at cross purposes? How can we raise climate finance to match the climate aspirations of our region and indeed the globe? We look forward to sharing experiences and perspectives and strengthening our efforts to support countries foster debt sustainability and sustainable finance, and basically to be able to achieve their sustainable development and climate ambitions. With that, thank you so much for investing your time with us, and we look forward to hearing from you and learning from you during the course of our meeting. Thank you. Back to you, Hamza.
Thank you, Kaveh. Thank you very much for this succinct but fairly comprehensive introduction to the kind of issues we will be discussing in the course of the next 4 days. Just for the interest of all of you, Tuesday and Wednesday, we have 4 sessions, and they'll be talking about essentially debt issues regarding the report on economic and social survey of Asia and the Pacific. And on Thursday and Friday, we'll be talking about sustainable financing issues in depth. So several of these issues that Kaveh highlighted will be discussed in detail with several experts over the course of the week. At the moment, I would let me move on with two very special keynote speeches that we have as part of this opening session. We have the honor of having Her Excellency Ms. Shireen El-Sharqawi, the Deputy Minister of Finance, Egypt, to share her views actually around debt. And I hear there's a new initiative that have been announced at the COP27 regarding debt formation of a debt coalition. Ms. El-Sharqawi holds a BA degree in economics and a master's in finance and investment from the University of Exeter, United Kingdom. Of course, given her busy schedule, she couldn't join in person, but we are honored to have her remarks delivered via video message. Will you please play the message?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific for this opportunity to participate as a keynote speaker for the 5-day expert group meeting on public debt and sustainable financing in Asia and the Pacific, and to introduce the Sustainable Debt Coalition initiatives, as well as invite various finance officials from governments in the region to join this coalition and obtain the feedback and insights from various experts in this regard. The initiative was launched by Minister Maid, the Minister of Finance of the Arab Republic of Egypt, on the Finance Day that was held during COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. This initiative has many pivotal points directed around debt sustainability and progressing climate and sustainability agendas. All concerned parties, whether debtors, creditors, MDBs, IFIs, philanthropies, and the private sector, are invited to join this coalition of the willing. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is going through challenging times exacerbated by tightening monetary policies and limited access to finance, coupled with higher cost of debt, as well as higher food and energy prices on the backdrop of COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and constrained budgets. This aggravates economic, social, and environmental pressures. The current situations required coerced effort for the world to join forces to further the development and sustainability agenda during this highly difficult period. The pressures on countries' fiscal space is quite notable and felt by each of our countries, with a share of public debt rising from 35% to 54% of GDP for emerging economies back since 2019. The pandemic further aggravated the situation, pushing developing countries' government debt by 9% to reach 63% of GDP. As we speak today, developing countries' public debt has further increased by almost 3.5% to reach 67.5% of GDP in the year 2021-2022. For Egypt, we were successful enough to lower our debt to GDP ratio from current highs of 102.8% of GDP in June 2016 to lower than 81% in June 2020, due to our sound fiscal and structural reforms as part of Egypt's economic program. But similar to the global trend, the impact of the COVID pandemic has burdened the government in terms of increased spending on social measures, that consequently reversed the downward trajectory of Egypt's debt to GDP ratio to 84.6% and 87.2% in June 2021 and 2022 respectively. Yet we remain optimistic that this will go back to the downward trajectory in the upcoming years to be below 80% debt to GDP ratio by June 2021, with more fiscal discipline and targeted support for the underprivileged segments. Currently, 23 African countries are either in debt distress or at risk of debt distress. Back in 2010, African governments were on average spending less than 5% of their revenues servicing foreign loans, but by 2021, the number had jumped to 16.5%, a figure higher than the 12.5% average of other emerging countries. The situation is further exacerbated by the fact that African countries are facing the so-called Africa premium, due to the prevailing unfavorable risk perceptions and lower liquidity on African sovereign bonds. African countries pay approximately 100 to 260 basis points more on their euro bonds than countries with similar ratings from other regions. As an African country, Egypt, being conscious of the difficulties faced by our continents, has opted to voice the needs of African nations through considering alternative innovative tools to provide solutions to the current challenging situation. We have therefore developed the Sustainable Debt Coalition Initiative in coordination with the United Nations Economic Commissions of Africa and the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at the University of Oxford as an attempt to generate additional investment and liquidity for sustainable projects. The coalition is guided by a declaration that governs the roles of member nations and other participants, with the aim of developing implementable mechanisms to reduce debt burdens and cost of debt, mainly to further environmental, sustainable, and developmental agendas. The Sustainable Debt Coalition aims to: number one, advance new and established mechanisms to significantly reduce the debt burden for developing countries and free fiscal space for investments with positive environmental, sustainable, and developmental outcomes. Number two, integrate debtor-defined key performance indicators aligned with the goals of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals, among others. Three, prioritize grants over debt in the provision of climate finance to enhance sovereign capacity to meet its environmental ambitions. Four, explore possible mechanisms for automatic debt suspension into existing and new debt issuances to developing countries. The mechanism of a debt swap is one example of such an initiative, where creditors agree to lift their outstanding debt and interest payments in exchange for additional allocations from the debtor country to developmental and sustainable projects. By alleviating part of the debt burden on debtors, more space will be available to fund climate, nature, sustainable investments, and more advancements in development agendas will be achieved without extra outlays from developed countries. It is important to note that the purpose of the debt swap mechanism is not simply a tool for restructuring or weighing off the debt burdens. Instead, it is to enhance sustainable and developmental outcomes. The early alignment of rating agencies is extremely important in this regard. Number five, philanthropies, civil society organizations, IFIs, and MDBs are key anchors in debt operations and can play a role in enhancing governance, oversight, as well as providing technical assistance for the preparation of sustainable project pipelines. As an example, their participation and involvement is extremely important. The effort and support of international institutions and MDBs in the Sustainable Debt Coalition will allow for the speedy progress in the global climate and sustainability agenda. Accordingly, the Debt Coalition also aims to move to a programmatic approach by moving from the current bilateral nature of debt swaps to a multi-creditor structure. The Debt Coalition also aims to explore sovereign debt guarantees and other forms of branded finance and enhance them to reduce cost of capital for debtor nations at scale. On a final note, I would like to invite other states and international financial institutions to join the Sustainable Debt Coalition, as well as encourage your input and shared experiences in successful debt operations that can be replicated to increase green and sustainable investments, as well as tackle environmental challenges. This is the time to act and guard the interest of humanity and future generations for the common good. Thank you, and wishing you all fruitful and interesting discussions.
We're very grateful for Her Excellency Ms. Al-Sharkawi's main messages around the newly formed or announced Debt Coalition initiative. There are several features of the initiative that Ms. Al-Sharkawi highlighted resonates with the kind of issues we are highlighting at our platform as well. I think going forward, ESCAP, along with several of the UN agencies, will be working together with other partners in trying to take some of the ideas forward in consultations with member states. I now have the honor of having a second keynote speaker. Again, will be a video recorded message because of the time differences, Professor Barry Eichengreen. Although Professor Eichengreen does not need much introduction, we all are his students in many ways over the course of years. But for those who are joining or listening to him for the first time, Mr. Professor Barry Eichengreen is a George C. Pardee and Helen N. Pardee Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley, United States of America. He has taught at the UC Berkeley since 1987. And before that, he had an academic position at Harvard University. He's also a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and research fellow of the Center of Economic Policy Research, London. In 1997-98, he was a senior policy advisor at the International Monetary Fund, and he is the fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, class of 1997. He was also the president of the Economic History Association during the 2011 and 2011 academic year. So may I request colleagues to play Professor Eichengreen's message that he prepared for us today.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be with you for this ESCAP meeting to talk about public debt. And if you know me, you will anticipate that I will speak about public debt in historical perspective. I suspect the way that I view the issue is somewhat different from how a number of other people do, but bear with me. So people have been warning about the dangers of excessive public debt for many years. If you're of my age, you will recall the 1980s and 1990s when there was already widespread concern in my country, the United States, and in Europe that public debts were excessive and unsustainable, which led to legislation and international agreements, legislation in the form of the 1990 U.S. Budget Enforcement Act, the Maastricht Treaty, and the Stability and Growth Pact in Europe, recently revised, in fact. The point being that all of these measures were indicative of the view of the fear that government spending and debts were dangerously out of control. Then, of course, we had the global financial crisis. We had the COVID-19 crisis. we are currently having the Russia-Ukraine global energy and food price crisis, in response to all of which governments turned to deficit spending and borrowing. They ran unprecedented deficits and accumulated unprecedented debts, unprecedented at least in peacetime. I show you some of the relevant figures here in the slide, and many Asian countries have been in the same boat, at least to a degree. So you can see here for the advanced countries, for emerging market economies, and for low-income countries, how debt to GDP ratios have risen over the last 15 years or so. Be cautious about the vertical axis, which varies from case to case. And there's another interesting observation here, which is that interest expenses have not risen commensurately with debt to GDP ratios. And I will come back to that point in a few moments. The questions being, is this greater tolerance of heavier debt to GDP ratios justified, and will it last, or is there about to be another sea change in how we view debt accumulation? Is it justified? I would argue clearly yes, that extraordinary circumstances like those of a global pandemic justify extraordinary action. I would argue further that a government that does not respond to this kind of all hands on deck public health emergency by mobilizing all available resources, including those resources that can only be mobilized by issuing debt, will not long retain its legitimacy. There are flaws in the analogy between the household budget constraint and the government budget constraint, but there are parallels as well, in the sense that a government that doesn't borrow in order to provide essential services during a deadly pandemic would be accused of dereliction, and rightly so. Such a government would be like parents who refuse to borrow to obtain life-saving surgery for a child. Indeed, states and rulers have long borrowed to meet emergencies. Rulers have long borrowed to expand their realm, their territory, but also to defend it against hostile invaders and to survive. Borrowing to mount a sturdy national defense, strengthen the state in the sense of successfully repelling invaders, but it also strengthened the state in a political sense, since a state that provided a sturdy national defense that protected residents against hostile invaders gained legitimacy in the eyes of its public, its residents, its citizenry. So it followed from this fact that Europe was the public debt pioneer. European states and sovereignties were first to issue public debt because war was especially prevalent in Europe. I show you Europe's political geography here, circa year 1200. The European continent was divided into literally hundreds of kingdoms, many no more than cities with modest hinterlands, and that political geography followed from Europe's physical geography as a landmass divided by mountain ranges and river valleys, posing natural obstacles to the formation of more extensive territorial states. That's something that the historical anthropologist Jared Diamond at UCLA has emphasized, for example. Contrast that with China's political and physical geography. Much of China, east of the eastern part of China, certainly is a great plain, which allowed the Qing dynasty to establish a unitary state already more than 2 millennia ago. giving China eventually a uniform written language, standardized currency, unitary tax system. And one of the first achievements of the emperors was to build a great wall to keep out Mongol invaders from the north. So for reasons of geography and internal unity, China lacked the same need to borrow to finance war. Again, you can see that Great Plain here, and I have a quote here from a recent study of the state in Chinese economic history. The Chinese state was unusually centralized. It built the first centrally administered state almost 200 years before Augustus established the Roman Empire. The country was ruled by a unified state with the emperor as a figure of political and moral authority. China's historical tendency towards political unification contrasts sharply with Europe's enduring political fragmentation after the collapse of Rome, leading to very different public debt histories in the two cases. So European sovereigns borrowed, but subject to constraints and limits. The sovereign borrowing was subject to commitment problems, the king or the sovereign being the supreme earthly power, the very embodiment of the state, as Louis XIV, the Sun King, reminded his subjects. The irony being that this unlimited power limited the sovereign's ability to borrow, since there was no higher power to prevent him from reneging on his debts. Sovereigns could only borrow, it followed, for short terms and at high interest rates. What had to happen first was the establishment of political checks and balances, limiting that previously unlimited sovereign power. So sovereign debt began to rise toward modern levels only with the creation of representative assemblies in which the creditors sat and were empowered to oversee tax collection and to authorize or not increases in public spending and debt issuance. It's with the creation of those representative assemblies in Italian city-states and then in the Netherlands and England that real interest rates on sovereign debt began to come down. So I show you the case of the Netherlands between 1600 and 1750, when the Estates General, that representative assembly, was established. And you can see how dramatically long-term real interest rates on sovereign debt declined over that century and a half, from the neighborhood of 8% to the neighborhood of 2%, as sovereign debt came to be recognized as an obligation of the state rather than of the individual occupying the throne. So there were political preconditions for the accumulation of modern levels of sovereign debt. There were economic preconditions. When we think about public debt today, we all think about R minus G, the real rate of interest on the debt minus the real rate of growth of the economy. The Industrial Revolution had to precede modern economic growth, had to precede the accumulation of modern levels of sovereign debt. Not only did R come down, as I showed you in the previous slide, but G, the rate of growth of the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio, went up. And you can see the long-term evolution of R minus G on the right here. And I will come back predictably to R minus G and what's going to happen to it next at the end of my talk. There had to be the development of a population of individuals with savings to invest in sovereign debt securities. So the commercial revolution had to precede this public debt revolution. And it's not a coincidence that the centers of this early modern commercial revolution, places like Venice, Genoa, the Netherlands, and Britain, were also the public debt pioneers. And finally, financial preconditions. There had to be a lender and liquidity provider of last resort to backstop the market in public debt. Again, it's not a coincidence that among the first places with central banks were the Netherlands and Britain, the case of the Bank of England here, which developed those quasi-public backstops as a financial precondition for the development of modern levels of public debt, with spillovers to private markets. So there's a modern literature on why Europe and not Asia. Asia was the richest part of the world. China was the most developed country in the world for more than half a millennium, up until 1700 or 1750, depending on whose estimates of per capita GDP you prefer. Why did the Great Divergence then occur? Why was the first industrial revolution European and not Asian? One answer is that Europe had a financial revolution before it had its industrial revolution. And it had a financial revolution because there were spillovers from public debt to the development of private debt markets. Public debt could be used as collateral for other borrowing and lending, and the same places that pioneered markets in public debt developed markets in other financial instruments, which fed the subsequent industrial revolution and modern economic growth. Over time, the uses of public debt have evolved, of course. Financing wars remains of premier importance. So World Wars I and II saw the two largest public debt explosions in the 20th century. But over time, governments have borrowed also for developmental purposes to invest in the infrastructure associated with modern economic growth, and now more recently to finance social programs and transfer payments as well. Then came COVID-19. That public health emergency was a crisis equivalent to war, and it elicited a warlike fiscal response. So the question on which I want to close is whether this sea change in attitudes and actions will persist, or will we see a reversion to the previous more conservative attitudes toward public debt. Much will depend, I think, on the evolution of interest rates and growth rates. Lower interest rates worldwide have made heavier debts more sustainable up until now. So the debt to GDP ratio in the United States has tripled over the last 2 decades, but debt service as a share of GDP has not risen at all because of declining interest rates in the United States, matched by declining interest rates in a variety of other countries. So here I show you the implicit interest rate on public debt in a variety of European countries. If responsible governments use all available instruments in an emergency, including their ability to borrow, prudent governments also enhance and restore that capacity to borrow once the emergency has passed. Enhancing and restoring that capacity is easier said than done, especially if interest rates are rising, as they are now, and growth is not. So I show you here the advanced country cases, focusing mainly on Europe. What you have on the horizontal axis is R minus G, and it varies depending on the interest rate that lenders charge different countries and how fast those economies can grow. On the vertical axis, I show you how much additional fiscal effort the increase in the primary budget surplus that a country will have to run in order to keep its debt to GDP ratio from rising further. On the left, we have the current unchanged R minus G, and you can see the Greek case here, where Greece has a very heavy debt to GDP ratio, but it is running a large primary surplus now, so it doesn't have to exert much additional fiscal effort. There are a variety of other advanced economies that are going to have to increase their fiscal effort, their primary budget surpluses, even on an unchanged R minus G, in order to keep their debt burdens from rising still further. Now, if you assume that R minus G is going to rise by a couple of percentage points because of higher real interest rates and maybe continuing stagnant real growth rates, you can see that there is a larger collection of countries that are going to have to exert even more fiscal effort to keep their debt ratios from rising. So there are going to be some difficult economic and political choices that will have to be made going forward. Trussonomics, the recent experience in the UK, illustrates the consequences, both in terms of difficult choices and now the fiscal effort that will have to be exerted. I don't think there are alternatives. Inflating away the debt is not an option because investors will react. More inflation will translate into higher interest rates on the debt. So a variety of countries have brought down their debt ratios this year through surprise inflation, but going forward, inflation is no longer going to be a surprise. What about faster economic growth? That's the painless way of reducing the debt to GDP ratios, but I think it's also wishful thinking. Previous productivity, there's the digital revolution and the green revolution in the offing, but I think it will take years before new technologies translate into faster growth. It took decades before the steam engine and the internal combustion engine and the personal computer translated into faster GDP growth worldwide. Firms have to fundamentally reorganize what they do. So the conclusion I draw is that it is important now to enhance and restore our capacity to borrow, because we've learned that these black swan events occur more frequently than previously supposed. And history shows that countries that have successfully done that without major economic, financial, and political dislocations have done so by turning to fiscal restraint when the time was right, which in my view means now, by growing their economies, and maybe by running modest, but not higher rates of inflation. History shows that failing to address the problem from all three angles is a recipe for disaster. I recommend this book if you want to read more along these lines. I'm sure this book is why management in its wisdom asked me to address you today. So I thank you for your attention and wish you a successful rest of conference.
As always, it was a pleasure listening to Professor Reichengreen, zooming out for the last 1,000 years and bringing us up to speed to the present day, the basic dynamics of debt over time, which we as economists all understand. Currently, we are living in the world where real interest rates are on the rise probably and growth is going down. So apparently, a fiscal consolidation expected are going to be quite painful and not easy answers. However, the question we are discussing in this expert group meeting actually takes one step forward, and we're asking even more difficult questions. Because under these difficult circumstances, and the United Nations at least, especially, We are talking about further investments coming from the public side as well. So how do we reconcile this conundrum, actually? How do we respond? What kind of policy choices that are available to us when we understand that the needs for investments are considerable, including from the public sector, in the face of rising debt problems and the recent dynamics of higher interest rates and slow growth prospects? Certainly, no easy answers are available. That's why we have gathered so many experts today and in the next 5 days. So once again, I'll thank Professor Ashton Green for setting aside time. Given a 14-hour time difference, it was certainly not easy to have him on board, but this topic, what he told me, was pretty close to his heart. So that's why we had his message. Okay, so we are perfectly doing on time. Let me now move to the roundtable part, a roundtable discussion of experts. So we are very privileged, actually, to have the honor of 6 very high-level experts join us today. Most of them are joining online. Several of them have other prior commitments, but I'm really grateful for their commitment and their support to our work. So they've agreed to shuffle their arrangements and join us. A couple of them will have to leave early. Some of them will be joining in the middle, but hopefully we'll be able to hear from all of them as we move forward. But before I start introducing, I have the honor of inviting Ms. Ruanwadi Suarmankol, who is actually here in person. She is the Secretary General of Securities and Exchange Commission. Okay, thank you. So let me first introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into the discussion. So let me start with the Secretary General of Securities and Exchange Commission of Government of Thailand, Ms. Ruanwadi Suarmankol. Ms. Ruanwadi Suarmankol obtained her LLB from Chulalongkorn University. She's a barrister at law from the Institute of Legal Education, Thai Bar Association, has an LLM degree from Harvard Law School, United States of America, and an MBA from Walter A. Haas School of Business, University of California at Berkeley. So prior to her appointment, she had several key positions at the Ministry of Justice, including Director General of the Legal Execution Department, Director General of the Probation Department, Inspector, Deputy Spokesperson, Deputy Director of the Office of Justice Affairs, Deputy Director General of the Rights and Liberties Protection Department, and Director of Dhanarak Asset Development Corporation Limited. So as you can see, she has extensive experience in practical policymaking across a range of ministries in her experience. Then I also have the honor of having our own previous Executive Secretary of United Nations Economic and Social Commission of Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP, Ms. Shamshad Akhtar. Ms. Shamshad Akhtar is national of Pakistan. She served as the Undersecretary General of the United Nations and as the 10th Executive Secretary of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific from 2014 to 2018, where she also actually served as the United Nations Sherpa for the G20. She has also served, as many of you know, as the Governor of the Central Bank of Pakistan and also as the Vice President of the Middle East and North Africa region of the World Bank. She has a long-standing career with multilateral development banks. She has also served at the Asian Development Bank for almost 50 years. Dr. Akhtar was a postdoctoral US Fulbright Fellow at the Harvard University. She holds a PhD in economics from the Scotland's Paisley College of Technology, as well as a master's in development economics from the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. Dr. Akhtar, a warm welcome to this roundtable. Then I have Professor Ulrich Walz, honor of having him here. He is the Professor of Economics and Director of the Center of Sustainable Finance at SOAS, University of London. We are especially thankful to Professor Walz because he's been literally traveling during the last week, and I think currently he's still in another commitment, and he'll be joining us, I think, in 10 to 15 minutes. But let me introduce him briefly. Professor Ulrich is the chairman of the Japan Economy Network and the co-editor-in-chief of the Asia-Europe Journal. Professor Ulrich is the director of the Global Research Alliance for Sustainable Finance Investment and serves on the Sustainable Finance Advisory Committee of the German federal government and the advisory panel of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for German Net Zero. That's called GFANZ. He's a co-chair of the Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery Initiative and serves on the advisory committee for the Climate and SDGs Debt Swap Mechanism of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. He's also a member of the CEPR Sustainable Finance Research and Policy Network and the World Bank's Green Recovery Monitoring and Evaluation Technical Group. I think he's still in the other commitment. He told me he'll be joining around 10:15 or so for half an hour, stepping aside from other commitment. So we'll hear him for sure shortly. Then I have Mr. Syed Muhammad Ali Abbas. He is currently the advisor to the European Department International Monetary Fund. Mr. Abbas is a sovereign debt expert with over 2 decades of experience acquired as an academic at the fixed income desk, country debt manager, and of course, as an IMF staff member. As an academic at Oxford, he wrote about the role of domestic debt markets in economic growth, later on the historical patterns and dynamics of public debt. He has recently co-edited a book with Professor Kenneth Rogoff on sovereign debt, a guide for economists and practitioners, which was published jointly by the Oxford University Press and the International Monetary Fund in 2019. At the IMF, he has been closely involved in several high debt country cases, including Ireland in 2010, Mongolia 2017, Jordan 2020 to 2022, Ukraine in 2015, and Argentina 2018. He was also the IMF's liaison to the Paris Club during 2015 and 2019. Mr. Abbas is currently serving as an advisor in the IMF's European Department. Thank you very much, Ali, for joining today. I know the time difference does not make it easy, but we're really grateful for your setting aside your evening and night time, I believe, in Washington. So thanks a lot for joining us today. Then I have the honor to introduce Mr. Jean-Paul Adam. He is currently the Director for Technology, Climate Change, and Natural Resource Management in the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Prior to taking on his role, Mr. Jean-Paul has served in the government of the Republic of Seychelles in several cabinet positions, including as the Minister of Finance, Trade, and the Blue Economy for 2015 and 2016, where he negotiated a debt for climate change adaptation swap and launched the process of Seychelles to become the first issuer of a blue bond in his country. Between 2010 and 2014, he was Seychelles Minister of Foreign Affairs, where he advocated for countries to embrace the concept of the blue economy to improve sustainability for island and coastal countries. He's a holder of a master's in international political economy from the University of Manchester and a BA English Literature and French from the University of Sheffield. Thank you, Mr. Jean-Paul Adam, for joining us today. Again, I know your other commitments and time difference did not make it easy, but we really appreciate your support in this work. And thank you very much for sharing with us the message of Minister Al-Sharkawi earlier today. I know you have been working closely with her office during the COP discussions a couple of weeks ago. Last but not least, I have Dr. Debapriya Bhattacharya. He is a macroeconomist and public policy analyst and is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue, Dhaka, Bangladesh, where he was his first executive director. Earlier, he was a senior research fellow at the Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, and he has been a former ambassador and permanent representative of Bangladesh to WTO and UN offices in Geneva and Vienna, president of UNCTAD's governing board, special advisor on LDCs to the Secretary General of UNCTAD, coordinator of LDC group of countries in the UN system in Geneva. Even currently, he is a member of the United Nations Committee for Development Policy. Did his master's and PhD in economics from the Plekhanov Institute of National Economy, Moscow, and later he did his postdoctoral research at Queen Elizabeth House, University of Oxford. He was a senior Fulbright Fellow at the Center for Global Development, Washington, D.C. So as you heard, we have a very privileged panelist here with us today. My apologies if I did not make the full introduction in the interest of time, but I want to get to the business of our discussions since we have very experienced panelists with us today. Let me start with Dr. Akhtar. Dr. Akhtar, in your recent report, co-authored with Professor Ulrich on debt relief, you highlighted the need to incorporate two key considerations. One, climate risks, and two, essential spending needs to enhance climate resilience and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals into the debt sustainability analysis carried out by the IMF and the World Bank. While such considerations could potentially stretch the debt threshold for countries, the global financial markets may not assess these debt thresholds in the same way. What can the international community do to support countries in reassessing the viability of such higher debt thresholds, which may be required for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals? Dr. Akhtar, over to you.
Right. So can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay. First, my special thanks to the Executive Secretary of ESCAP for the invite, and also Kaveh Zahdi here, and yourself. It's great to be back on your platform. Let me try to first run you through some of the essentials as I see. As you know, debt distress was brewing before the pandemic, and it has clearly now mounted to levels that are highly unsustainable already. And it's different dimensions depending on the geography we are. And in midst of this, we have to recognize that the composition of the debt by country is very different. Now, first of all, a word about the fact that the two G20 initiatives, the debt moratorium and the common debt treatment, framework treatment, have been fairly inadequate to meet the diversified requirements of trying to have an effective debt resolution system within a time period that could avoid worsening of the situation. So it's really in that context that Ulrich and some of us, other co-authors, produced a report. And we were probably one of the first ones in November 2020, in midst of the pandemic, that actually alerted the leaders, both at the G20 level and at the multilateral development institutions, that debt resolution strategy has to be bold and comprehensive, and it has to recognize the creditor mix, which of course varies across countries, but net debt negotiations have to be inclusive, as private credit has grown in a range of countries, while in other multilateral and bilateral countries, bilateral credit, it features significantly, and new creditors such as China have to be a part of the process. So to get the debt and development dynamics in sync, in November 2020, a debt relief for a green inclusive recovery proposal was structured. And in June, it was enhanced to discuss securing private sector participation and creating policy space for sustainable development. And it's really in that context that we talked about the enhancement of the debt sustainability analysis, which is very critical. And I will get to it in a minute. But let me talk about the G20 common framework need for enhancement, which has been talked about by various analysts and leaders and multilateral development bank, we were the first ones to talk about extending the debt restructuring to go beyond low-income countries to middle-income countries and emerging markets. We talked, of course, as I said, enhancement of DSA, a critical analytical input for structuring debt relief to account for climate risks and spending needs to scale up investments in climate resilience, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it's good to see that the two pieces of the IMF, one, debt sustainability analysis methodology for market access and for low-income countries, has been now supplemented by another DSA, which incorporates the sustainability elements. A third point that our report highlighted is to encourage private creditors to participate in debt restructuring and bear a fair share of burden, and IMF should make its program conditional on restructuring process to include private creditors on a comparable basis. I think this was a bit ahead of its time, and it created a bit of a panic amongst the MDBs too. And then we made a point that we should explore Brady-type credit enhancement for new bonds that would be swapped with significant haircut for old debt to facilitate debt negotiations. Our dilemma today is that we are not the backyard of the United States or Fed Reserve taking the hit on that or galvanizing the support for it, and we need to have a home as to or a mechanism where these haircuts could be settled, because eventually we have to have private debt has reached a proportion in countries that require a fair deal from them. We also talked about encouraging IMF and financial authorities of advanced countries and China to incentivize commercial participation in restructuring through moral suasion and other regulatory tools. And we talked about establishment of a guarantee facility for green and inclusive recovery, which we propose should be managed by MDBs with clear performance targets and metrics, offering collateral which would be released to the benefit of private creditors, and the missed payment repaid by the sovereigns to the guarantee facility. Now, of course, there are some instruments that have evolved, but this was a much more comprehensive proposal that we tabled. We talked about governments receiving debt relief should also enhance debt transparency and public debt management capacities. And in context of this list, we talked about channeling funds of green and inclusive recovery to facilitate governments to invest in SDGs and climate adaptation and mitigation. So governments receiving debt relief, we argued, should develop their own green and inclusive recovery strategy and an action plan to advancing the sustainable development and climate goals. We, of course, also went through to look at the debt climate swaps, and I'm glad we have an authoritative person to talk about it. I have engaged with him quite a bit on that. So now, to sum up, what are the benefits of the reform of the IMF and World Bank's debt sustainability analysis enhancement? I think it's substantive, because today, when I'm sitting in Pakistan looking at the debt sustainability analysis produced by the fund program as a part of its recent release, one gets this feeling that Pakistan's debt is sustainable. And that's what brings a lot of discomfort when the country is going through all kinds of crises. A debt crisis not being recognized. We have had exchange rate moved from market exchange rate to basically a weird type of exchange rate regime, which is hurting the economy, but also the debt sustainability analysis. And as you all know, we had one of the worst floods, and United Nations played a very critical role in raising awareness of it. But the bottom line is that the debt sustainability analysis did not factor any of those elements. And this is an area where a lot of work needs to be done to fully incorporate debt and sustainability risks, and of course have estimation of the investment needs. Now, should we continue with the old style debt sustainability frameworks? My suggestion would be no, because these are fundamentally suffering from a lot of shortcomings. They are not necessarily absurd because they fit the old style debt analysis, but they will not be very futuristic for us in assessing the debt-related risks. We have to account for climate risk. And I'm going to stop in a minute, and we have to capture potential fiscal impacts of climate change. And I think we have to complement IMF for the comprehensive surveillance system that they have been producing analytical reports and will be institutionalizing. That will play a significant role in enhancing and augmenting the DSAs. And it will also contribute to investments because there will be climate stress test in its DSAs for various countries. It will look at physical risks as well as perhaps transition risk, hopefully. And of course, depending on the country's scenario, these are important moves, but DSAs also need to systematically account for risk of rising cost of capital, stranded asset risk, as well as they have to look at the options on how to reduce dependency of the economy and of public revenues on fossil fuel related activities, and also carbon pricing and all the others, and the nature risk. So I stop here in interest of time, and I'm sure if there's need, I can come back. Over to you, Hamza.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar, for a very comprehensive introduction to the work we have been doing for the last few years on this topic of debt relief, especially highlighting the importance of enhancing DSA, how to engage middle-income countries in this process, or how to incorporate actually middle-income countries' concerns while providing debt relief, how to get private creditors actually on the table, and more importantly, also on the other side, what are the responsibilities to those who are receiving debt relief, especially in terms of debt transparency and so on and so forth. Several of these aspects actually are part of our forthcoming work, and we have already benefited from your research so far, and we'll continue to remain engaged with you. So thank you very much. We will certainly come back to you, provided you are still available, with some follow-up questions. Now let me request Secretary General Ruan Wadi. You're sitting in a very important policy position in Thailand. So could you please share your thoughts and views on the state of development of green and sustainable finance under your jurisdiction? Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Malik, and then good morning to everyone. It's my privilege to share experience, especially in terms of the Thai capital market in sustainable finance amongst distinguished experts. And thank you for the UN ESCAP inviting us to share. As you raised about the question, what the experience for the sustainable finance in our jurisdiction, I must say that at the beginning, SEC Thailand had emphasized clearly about the sustainable issues. It becomes our top priority and our key flagship in order to achieve the SDG goals of UN, and also to achieve the Thai capital market of the so-called building up the sustainable capital market. I must say that we cannot act alone. We have to work together with all stakeholders, both the public and private, and within the country, and also with the cooperation from international cooperation, especially the UN. I must say that at the beginning, before the COVID came along, my colleague and I have discussed lengthily what the role of SEC. We are not the practitioner, we are the operator, we have come to the conclusion that the utmost role that we have to do is to create an ecosystem to accommodate all stakeholders for the sustainable finance in Thailand. And of course, we have to work together very closely with the with the Ministry of Finance and also the Bank of Thailand, so that within the ecosystem that my colleague and I have concluded, we elaborate that at least 6 key points we need to make it happen and then have to develop. First, of course, dealing with the both demand and supply, that issuer and then the investor. The second is about the product itself. And then the fourth is about external reviewer, and of course, the information platform. And last is about cooperation. Considering the time, I think that I may elaborate each point and highlight the key important. For the issuer, everyone aware, transparency is the key. Transparency is key. So that I have to inform you that starting from this year, with the work together with the listed company, we are right now required, or the listed company, no matter what size they are, to disclose at the first time the non-financial data in terms of the sustainability report. We tackle into 2 areas. Of course, one is the climate change and the carbon emission activities, so on and so forth. And the second one is also important, is about the human right. So that once on the eye of the issuers and then on the eyes of the investor right now, they can look into the sustainability activity of each 700 plus listed company of Thailand. So that the challenge going ahead is how can we move along the supply chain and value chain, so that this is going to be a big issue for us next year, Mr. Malik. How to make sure that all the value chain of the listed company could disclose the sustainability in their activity. And for the investor, of course, we encourage all the institutional investor to incorporate the risk assessment to focus in terms of the climate risks and also the ESG risks, so that we work together with all the mutual fund, the government pension fund, and then all kinds of the institutional investor to go along with having ESG as their risk assessment before they make investment. And also we have promote the so-called the SRI, the practical guideline on disclosure of information of sustainable and responsible investing fund in April this year. And of course, we work together with the UN on the SDG investor map, and also to promote more and more on the PRI, the principle for responsible investment. I have to say to you that we get a good cooperation among the institutional investors right now. They would not, of course, they have a negative list not to invest in the listed company that do not comply with the ESG, and so on and so forth. And the product itself, if you look along, and then we have in our website, not taking your more time, during the past 3 years, the Thai market, especially in the sustainable finance, is growing and growing. We have all kinds of products, thanks to my colleagues, and then with the help with international organization, running from the green, social sustainability, and SLB. And then this is, I think that accommodate the appetite for the local investor and also international investor. They look into to invest more and more in green, so that we work on that and then have a quite a growing number. But I think that we see more rooms to grow. I think that whatever they raise at the moment, not to accommodate more demand, I think that we have to highlight a so-called to be building up the green buildings, so on and so forth in Bangkok area, so that right now they raise fund for the transportation, so on and so forth. And for the external reviewer, this is the key. We work together with the international, especially if I say the ADB, to promote having the local reviewer to perhaps mitigate the high cost of having the international one. At the moment, we have one, and then we are heard that there are the second come along. And the international, and also the information platform, this is a very key point. So that to locate all types of the products and for the investor. We work together with the Thai Bond Market Association to have the ESG bond information platform. And also we link with the Luxembourg Green to have the the platform for the Thai issuer, especially for the Thai government that last year issued the very first sovereign bond, sustainable bond, and so they'll be listed at the Luxembourg Green already. Luckily that we made a trip to Luxembourg before the COVID came. And we could sign in the MOU with the Luxembourg Green, with the, I have to thank to my colleague with their very long vision on that, even so that we are quite established already, both the local platform and international platform. Last but not least, cooperation is the key. I was asked, I think I have a minute left, how we work together amongst all the regulators here. We are the country, we have a multilateral regulator, not only one regulator, but there is no disadvantage at all. We talk together, and then it's a highlight that the Minister of Finance, he make emphasis of the collaboration. And as you perhaps be aware that this year is a APEC for Thailand, and the Prime Minister already announced a BCG industry, so on and so forth. So that they're working together with the regulator. Back in September last year, Bank of Thailand, Stock Exchange of Thailand, SEC, and then also in insurance, and also Minister of Finance. We signed up as a commitment, not a protocol one, as a commitment to strengthening the local infrastructure for the sustainable finance. I think that we have 5 areas, but the very key point is about taxonomy. And taxonomy, I have to emphasize 3 times, because this is seem to be the key ingredient for the success. How do you ensure that you raise funds and then be used in a sustainable way? And we don't want to create new things, I think that when I was young, I was told that you don't need to reinvent the wheel if the wheel is there, and then just to make sure that international taxonomies and then be adopt into the local one. So that the working group look into taxonomy, they compare with the so-called the ASEAN one, because we have the ASEAN capital market, the CMF, they work very heavily on that. And the second one is the capacity building. Is I think that 1 or 2 key that we still working on that, but with the time given, I think I may end my sharing, and then perhaps we'll take up more on the second round. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Somankol, for sharing in detail actually the work that you have done or led in Thailand across a range of aspects which you call correctly in the ecosystem for sustainable finance, be it disclosure, transparency requirements, focus on human rights and climate risks, which is very important, I think, from our perspective, importance of taxonomy, cooperation, external reviews, so on and so forth. In our work, we are trying to develop what we're calling a roadmap for the region in terms of taking forward the recent growth of sustainable finance in the region. We'll certainly learn more from Thailand's experience, and we'll certainly highlight the examples from how Thailand has actually led this work for the benefit of other countries who are trying to follow the same path. So we will certainly come back to you. Let me go around the table with some moving on with other panelists. I believe Professor Ulrich Walz have finally managed to join us today. Professor Walz, can you turn on the camera? So I think I can
hello, and I wish I could turn on the camera, but so I've been in hundreds of Teams meetings and I never had a problem. but for some reason, so maybe the reason is that I am actually right now in Kuala Lumpur at Bank Negara, Malaysia, and so maybe there's some kind of security setting that doesn't allow me to switch on the camera. And apologies also that I'm not able to join the entire discussion, but thanks so much, Hamza, for having me.
No worries, Professor. No worries, Professor. We understand you have been traveling all around. I believe you just stepped out of another commitment for half an hour. So we'll certainly take advantage of your presence here and think of it as a first interaction between the work my team is doing, and we have been learning from your other work, and we will certainly remain engaged with you down the line.
Yeah, and it's actually very related to the topic, because I'm this week in Kuala Lumpur because the SOA Center for Sustainable Finance, together with the CSIM Center in KL, has been, we're doing a capacity building for the ASEAN central banks on climate change and different aspects of central banking. And this week, we're looking at climate change and monetary policy. So very related.
Excellent. So let's touch upon these themes, actually. So in your recent CEPR publication, Scaling Up Sustainable Finance and Investments in the Global South, you noted that the ASEAN +3 sustainable markets have a higher share of unrated green and social and sustainability-linked bonds compared to the EU, and a lower share of local currency-denominated sustainable bonds. How can the region, setting aside the advanced economies of countries that are ahead in these areas, such as China and Singapore and Indonesia, how can the region develop a larger domestic investment base for local currency bonds, especially local currency sustainable bonds? And since I know we have a small window to engage with you, please feel free to highlight other messages on the theme that you would like to share with all of us. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Hamza. Well, I'd say that whether GSS bonds are rated or unrated is not that important, but what matters, of course, is where the investment is flowing, and we do need to make sure that it is flowing in the right areas. And what the chairman just mentioned about taxonomies is certainly an important issue, but we do need much more efforts to really strengthen domestic financial resource mobilization. And if we look at developing Asia, one important issue is that actually a lot of the countries in the region have been exporting capital. And you know, we've been talking a lot about climate finance flowing from advanced countries to developing emerging economies, but de facto, we do see a lot of capital exports, and there are a lot of reasons for these capital exports, which are manifested also in capital account surpluses of many countries. But the investment needs are, of course, enormous. So we do need to strengthen domestic financial resource mobilization, and strengthening domestic capital markets is really a very critical element here. And so if you think back or look back at the last 20 years, after the Asian financial crisis, there were concerted efforts to develop local currency bond markets, and these were quite successful. And this has been a very, very important development. But now we also need to strengthen local currency green and sustainable bond markets. So I think we need more policy efforts in this direction, and there's a lot that national policymakers can do. Central banks, supervisors, they can be providing an appropriate framework to facilitate such investments. But there are also important regional initiatives that can be further developed. For example, there is the EMEAP group, that's the executive meeting of East Asia Pacific central banks, which comprises 11 central banks from the region. They last year launched a project as part of the Asian Bond Fund to invest in local currency denominated green bonds to stimulate this. I think that's a great initiative, and we need more initiatives like that. And I would say that there is a very critical role also for public development banks at the national level, at the regional level, and also kind of global public development banks, so World Bank, to drive investment in climate action, both adaptation, mitigation, but of course also other investments relevant for the SDGs. And one big problem has been that even though there is a lot of capital looking for investment and also looking for green investment, there are not sufficient investable assets, so kind of safe assets, and ideally assets that are also green. And I see a great role for public development banks because they can issue bonds, and they can be labeled as green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, and so on. And they can then raise private capital, both domestically and internationally, to then really have a big push investment, which is needed right now. So I think we need an interplay of private investors, but also of public actors to really make sure that private capital is flowing in the right directions. And we need much more efforts in this direction now.
Thank you, Professor Wall. Since I know you need to go, if we have a couple of more minutes, if I got a quick follow-up question right now to you, rather than waiting for later. In your 2015 book, Financing the Green Transformation, How to Make Green Finance Work in Indonesia, you highlight several policy recommendations to support governments in mobilizing green investments. For the benefit of our participants here today, could you highlight some of the salient recommendations from that work, which are more applicable, you think, in the region?
Yeah, it's nice that you mentioned this because, you know, this is already quite some time ago, but this was indeed my very first project with a central bank, with Bank Indonesia, on how to scale up sustainable finance, and that book is a result of that. So in our work, we looked at both the supply and the demand side for green finance, and both are incredibly important. So on the real economy side, we absolutely need good kind of policy frameworks that really will facilitate investment. So just to take Indonesia as an example, but it does apply to other countries in the region as well. You know, Indonesia has huge investment opportunities, for example, in renewable energy and all kinds of other sustainability areas, but let's take renewable energy. But the sad reality is that, and I think this has been improving now, but there's still much to do, that the framework conditions haven't been as supportive as should be. Yeah? So having good policy frameworks where investors can really make these investments is critical, because it's not just the supply of green finance, it's also, you know, what are different, you know, feed-in tariff schemes and so on. So very practical things. So I've spoken over the decades with a lot of investors who've been very keen on investing in renewable energy, in other sustainability areas in Indonesia, and they've been struggling. And so facilitating these investments is important. But then, of course, you also need, on the financial side, clear guidance. You need definitions on what qualifies as green. So that's the issue of taxonomies. But also, you need to make sure that financial institutions really adequately price climate, sustainability risks and impacts. So there is a lot about developing the prudential frameworks, and things like climate stress testing and so on, because it's not only about scaling up green finance, it's also about reducing dirty finance, because we really need to rechannel capital away from dirty areas of the economy towards clean, green areas of the economy. So it's really a broader package, and central bank supervisors have to set the broader framework conditions to really make this alignment of the financial system with climate sustainability goals possible. Because the financial system at the end of the day is really at the very heart of the economy. And if decision makers in the finance sector don't take account of climate sustainability risks and impacts, then we have a big problem. But of course, as I said before, we can't shift all the blame and all the work to finance. It has to be an interplay of both the real economy and the financial sector, and both are absolutely vital. And that means we, of course, need a clear steer from government.
Thank you, Professor Walls. I think this is right to the T. Given your time, once again, thank you so much for your commitment and your support to our engagement today. I know you have to go back to engaging in the workshop that you are running at the moment that you just mentioned in Kuala Lumpur. All the best with that. My team and I will be certainly in touch with you once we have further in our research on these issues, and love to have you have a look at it again for some further feedback. Thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you so much, and I look forward to visiting ESCAP in 2 weeks or something.
Thank you. Sure.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Things are certainly becoming normal, so I hope we can have more in-person meetings as we move forward. Let me now move to the next panelist, Saeed Ali Abbas, who joined us from Washington. Thank you, Ali, once again for staying up late with us. I know you have a formal presentation with us just to facilitate your remarks, but let me frame the question first, and feel free to deviate or share related perspectives on the subject. So one issue which I think Dr. Akhtar also touched upon briefly, the liquidity challenge, that is the inability to roll over potentially sustainable debt, is a major source of debt distress in several developing countries, especially those with poor credit ratings. What can the international community do, or what IMF actually advises countries to do, to ensure that countries which are solvent in the long run have continuous access to development financing at a reasonable rate, rather than advised to make immense development sacrifices for an arguably temporary crunch? Over to you, Ali.
Thank you, Hamza. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, excellent. It's a great pleasure to be here, Hamza. And most people don't know, but we went to the same college, and it's really nice to reconnect at this auspicious forum. I wanted to talk about situations in which countries have debt problems that have surfaced and that need to be resolved. So this is a slightly different situation than the one that you posed in your question, but I'm happy to come to that later. The reason I wanted to talk about this is that we are, in a world where major global headwinds have struck emerging markets and low-income countries, and it will be a challenge to maintain debt sustainability in these circumstances. And the size of the terms of trade shocks and the tightening of financial conditions is such that it is possible that some countries will end up with situations which require engaging creditors. And I think it is important to just go through what the key elements of efficient sovereign debt resolutions are, to remind us all of how to achieve these at as low cost as possible. So if we could move to the first slide. There are four, I would postulate that there are four key ingredients of efficient sovereign debt resolutions. And the first one, this is obviously in the order in which things happen, but also I think from an importance perspective, timely recognition of the debt problem, early action by the debtor sovereign to pursue a preemptive pre-default restructuring would generally mean that the resolution is less costly. The second is a credible sizing of the debt problem, where, as Ms. Akhtar was saying, debt sustainability analysis or the DSA is critical. And I will shed more light on that and how climate issues are being incorporated. The third is effective creditor engagement, where we would want to differentiate between debtor-creditor engagement and creditor-creditor engagement. And fourth is the role of innovative instruments to close the deal, because often there are differences between debtors and creditors on the macroeconomic outlook, and you need some sort of instrument, state contingent, to bridge that difference. So let me go through each of these one by one. So next slide, please. So timely recognition of the debt problem. There is a large literature that has documented, as you know, the too little, too late problem in sovereign debt crises. Um, while the too little, too late, both of these too little and too late um, problems have persisted, I think the one that is more vexing and more persistent is the too late problem, which is that sovereigns, when they face debt problems, they do not move early to try and resolve those problems. There is a tendency to throw money at the problem, to gamble for redemption, as I will mention later, but not to address the problem early on, and even to engage with IFIs early on to stem the problem and obtain a better equilibrium. And this problem of too late has both analytical and political roots. On the analytical side, it's not easy to identify, and this is the question that you also mentioned, that there could be sovereigns that have sustainable long-term positions but are facing stress. It's not easy to identify if the sovereign has reached that tipping point where adjustment and liquidity provision would no longer be enough and debt relief from creditors is necessary. Um, Now there are guides in the terms of in the form of bond spreads that can provide a good signal, but markets can be shallow in bonds, and the yields can be quite volatile in some circumstances. You have sovereign ratings, but we find that they're often late after the event or the tipping point has been reached. In this context, good sovereign risk and debt sustainability models can help. I was very happy to be the lead of the team which redesigned the fund's sovereign risk and debt sustainability framework for market access countries, which was released this year. And as you would have seen in that framework, there is a module on climate change. There is a way to also capture natural disasters, but also longer term climate change related pressures from adaptation investments, from efforts needed to mitigate carbon emissions. So this is a much improved framework, and I would urge people to look at it. Section 7 is in this link that is provided, deals with climate change. The other route, which I alluded to earlier, is political. It is very costly for incumbent governments to declare that the sovereign needs to restructure its debt. There is an incentive to gamble for resurrection, and governments often try to hide the problem so they don't reveal the full extent of the indebtedness. They shift some losses off the books. They pursue risky means, collateralized borrowing, or undertake costly market financing with put options, which basically means that you're borrowing. You tell people I'm borrowing for 3 years, but then there is a put option on some spread event, which actually means that it could be much shorter term borrowing. And all of these strategies make the problem worse. So that, coupled with the delay in recognizing the problem or approaching the creditors, it makes the solution more difficult. Because by the time you come to the solution, the problem has become deeper and much larger haircuts have to be negotiated with creditors. Let's move to the next slide, please. So the second, ingredient in efficient sovereign debt resolution is a credible sizing of the debt problem. So assuming that a decision to restructure the debt has been taken, there are four key questions that need to be answered before the debt relief envelope can be determined. How much do creditors need to provide debt relief or financing? So the first is we need to take a view on what the GDP and market access path for this country would be during and after restructuring. And from what we've seen is that people, it is common to be optimistic on the GDP path. GDP often, sinks during such events and then sometimes takes time to come back. Um, but there is often too much pessimism on market reaccess, and this is why countries often hesitate to go into restructurings because they fear they will be cut out from markets for very long. But examples that we've seen in Ukraine, 2015 as an example, undertook an orderly debt restructuring, and within 2 years, Ukraine was back in the market. So we need to firstly take a view on GDP and market access paths. The second is what is the limit of feasible fiscal and external adjustment? Um, as was implicit in your question also, it is important to avoid overestimating the will to implement difficult adjustments. Just by putting a number on the table doesn't mean that that adjustment would be delivered, especially when times are tough and there is a recession. But in restructuring situations, if the adjustment is too shallow, it will complicate the negotiations with creditors who want to make sure that they do the least amount that is needed and that the sovereign is doing its part and the taxpayers are doing their part. The third question is how much financing is available. And again, here we are talking about um, a context where the debt problem has been recognized. So this is an unsustainable situation. Um, it is critical that IFI liquidity support is not wasted on bailing out creditors. And maybe I can speak a little bit to your question, Hamza. When a sovereign realizes that its sort of exposure with private creditors is beginning to fall, that's not a good sign. And in those contexts, I mean, IFI liquidity support is silver because it comes with long maturities, low interest costs, but it becomes gold in these circumstances. And expending that gold on paying out private creditors when the country has huge needs means that you're taking out resources from the country, which will then have to be made up through either a devaluation, which produces more, net exports, or through a tax effort or spending cuts, which again would be a burden on the population. So you have to undertake a resource transfer if you lose the liquidity or financing that you get in these difficult times from international financial institutions. This is why one of our policies is that when you are in a situation where debt sustainability is not clear cut, countries should consider reprofiling, preemptively reprofiling their debts with private creditors, even domestic creditors, if that is feasible. And reprofilings mean that you're not really seeking large NPV relief. Usually, the NPV relief is on the order of 10% or so. You basically take the maturities falling due in the next 3-4 years and you push them out. You continue to pay interest, the same interest, or could be an adjusted interest rate on that reprofiled debt. But that gives enormous financing breathing space to the sovereign at a time, and it avoids the need for heavy and GDP contracting or pro-cyclical fiscal consolidations. So once the financing envelope from the IFIs is known, then I think it is you're in a position to tell the creditors what kind of magnitude of debt relief is needed. And here again, the fund plays a very important role through the DSA. By sizing the envelope of debt relief, by setting debt sustainability targets in terms of medium-term debt to GDP levels, debt service ratios, and gross financing needs to GDP ratios. Next slide, please. Now, two slides on creditor engagement. The first one is on debtor-creditor engagement. And here I think it is useful to recap what the distilled wisdom is on how different creditors behave. And sovereign debtors need to understand this when engaging with creditors. Now, the assumed creditor hierarchy is that, you know, the fund is the preferred creditor, accepted as has the preferred creditor status. You have the multilateral development banks, perhaps other IFIs after that. Then you have the official bilateral creditors, then the private creditors. In practice, however, governments are highly averse to approaching or touching their private creditors, even if it is a light reprofiling. And this is a bit unfortunate, but still, this is a fact, and it's important to understand why this is the case. And the reason is that they are afraid of losing market access. And obviously, when governments borrow in the bond market, there are no strings attached. Versus when you borrow from an official bilateral creditor, there may be diplomatic or other you know there may be other interests that are discussed as part of that support. Similarly, with IFIs, where there is conditionality, but with investors, this is free money, and governments don't want to lose that access. It is also the case that rating agencies, they invariably focus on credit events around private bondholders, external private bondholders, and so they would not really say that a country has entered restructuring if the country got a rollover of its claims from a non-Paris Club creditor or from some other bilateral creditor. They would not consider that that's a restructuring event, although from a cash flow perspective, it is de facto a restructuring. What credit rating agencies focus on is whether private bondholders are touched. Countries also sometimes have broader concerns about the domestic financial system, which they think could get triggered if they touch their private debt. Um, this is why governments invariably first pursue their official bilateral creditors to reschedule their claims or provide new financing to meet maturing obligations, and leave approaching private creditors as a last resort. And this often complicates the problem, because you have a situation where new money is coming in, but it is being used to pay off private creditors because the governments don't want to restructure their private claims. But it leads to a drainage of that key liquidity, which, if it was used to soften the recession or soften the blow, could help mitigate the fiscal consolidation, etc., that otherwise would have to be gone through.
Ali,
Now,
my apologies
yes,
to come in here. Can you just a little bit shorten the last part?
yeah,
Because
I
the
will
other
do that.
probably have to leave, I think.
Yes.
Thank
So, the reality is that private creditors are likely to provide deeper, more upfront relief than official creditors once a decision has been made that the restructuring will involve both PSI and OSI. And then there is some, points about sovereign debtors' good faith. Maybe the next slide, and I'll conclude with that. We'll leave the fourth slide for later. There are different processes for official bilateral creditors, where the Paris Club is well established, but the common framework is becoming more relevant because of the large non-Paris Club share that we are seeing. But there are teething problems there which need to be looked at. For private creditors, there has been progress through the contractual approach, use of enhanced collective action clauses, also majority voting provisions and syndicated loans. But there are difficult issues, in how to treat external versus domestic private creditors, collateralized debt, which messes the hierarchy of claims, and the lingering ability of vulture funds to hold out where contractual gaps still exist. And obviously, then there are creditors and instruments that straddle both processes, which, so bond holdings by sovereign wealth funds, which are essentially, which could be controlled by the government. Similarly, plurilaterals, which are in the middle of official bilateral creditors and multilateral creditors. These can create complications, which are discussed in some of these papers. Let me pause here, Hamza. Back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali, for accommodating my request. I appreciate your very thorough, detailed presentation material here. We have actually a whole chapter and whole session in the EGM, I think, the third day on the subject as well. I'm sure we'll benefit more. And if time permitting, I'll certainly come back to you for you to complete the last part of your presentation. And yes, it is a pleasure to see you. We go back 30 plus years. Those of you who are ever bored of Ali's work on debt, he's a pretty established, well-read poet as well, if I recall correctly. So you can benefit from that also. So nice to see you, Ali. Uh, I have actually two panelists before completing the first round, but the Secretary General, Ms. Wanwadi, has to actually leave for another commitment. So my apologies to John Paul. Just hold on to your horses for 5 more minutes. Very briefly, Secretary General, we wanted to learn from some specific example, actually. So in many Asia-Pacific economies, there is a shortage of investable green projects, high investments in fossil fuels, lack of effective carbon pricing, and weak climate finance information architecture, such as data, disclosure, regulation, taxonomies. You alluded to some of those in your first remarks as well. What, in your experience, has been some of the challenges in developing these sustainable finance markets? What is the plan to further scale up sustainable finance that other countries can benefit actually from Thailand's experience?
Thank you, and my apologies for leaving early. My apologies to other experts as well. And to your question, I think that I have to come back to the fundamental again, that you asked about challenges and then what plans that we want to scale up, right? I think that for this area, I think that again, coming back to the taxonomy for sure, because it's the way to make sure that the investment that raised can be channeled to the right industry for that. Second is about the transition of finance toward the low carbon. And third is about data infrastructure. I think data is very important too. And luckily for Thailand, as I said early on, that we require mandatory for listed company to disclose their sustainability for this year. So that I think that at least we start to have a compile of the good data. But again, we can't stop there, and then we have to develop more and more. And last is about how to make sure the SME, and as I said, the value chain and the supply chain can come into this area as well, you know. And if I may, for taxonomy, as I said, this is a fundamental to a good understanding. Because I think that people want to be certain that whatever their investment have to be channeled to the sustainability area, the industry, you know. I mean, they are afraid of the so-called greenwashing, so on and so forth. But then, as I said, we work locally and then internationally for that. I'm sure that with the working group of the 5 regulator, my colleague informed me that by this year, or perhaps early this year, they would develop the Thailand taxonomy. But as I said, we don't reinvented the new wheel, you know, but we want to develop or amplify from the international taxonomy for that. And then for the government, I think that for public uh, uh, fundraising, I think that is a good area for that. You know, as I said, that we Thailand issues already the sovereign accessibility bond at the first time. But I guess that if we look at other areas of the green, I think the government can play a role into this. You know, but having sure that they use the the taxonomy to as a direction for that. You know. Coming back to the transitional activity, I think that SLB is a key solution to go for that. But one thing I have to inform you, I think everyone perhaps well aware that the cost of the green or sustainability bond is not that cheap, you know, it's still costly compared to the regular bond. For us, you know, we whatever we can perhaps facilitate, accommodate. We waive all the fee of the Thai SEC, but again, it's not that huge amount, you know. But at least to be indication that we facilitate on that. But for the SLB, I think that what composition of that is very encouraging. They can set up the threshold on for that. I think that the SLB can be one of the part to move the finance from the energy sector to transform from the fossil fuel to the renewable energy. I think for this, and for the climate change information architecture and the carbon pricing. This is another area. Thailand, as perhaps you were aware, that our minister that he attended the COP27 already make a commitment. Also, right now, the related parties and organizations working on to build up the carbon credit market in Thailand. And SEC was lately consulted on that. But again, that need to be the industry or the private sector to build on that. What we can even accommodate is set up some rule and also to share experience on this. It would be part of the challenges that we want to overcome on this. If you have the carbon pricing to begin with, I think that it would also encourage the industry to go along on this. And last but not least, it's about the SME. This is, as I said, is a key area that we cannot ignore. We have to make sure that how could we encourage SME to come along this area. But again, considering that it should not be cause what you call obstacle, because SME to begin with, they don't have much expertise. They perhaps not have many resources to begin with, but their role in the economy is very great, because they contribute more, over for perhaps 50% to GDP already, and also they employ many what we call the workforce. But again, this is a challenge that Thai SEC and together with our other stakeholders need to think about the plan. How could we accommodate SME to come into this area for not only aware of the importance of the ESG, but also to incorporate the ESG in their work process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manwadi. This is wonderful. For very specific examples from Thailand, I hope we'll try and highlight, as I said in our report, the Thailand experience for the benefit of other countries. Let me now move to our next panelist. I have two more to go, and hopefully we'll be able to have some time for the question and answer sessions from the floor. This is our colleague, Mr. Jean-Paul Adam. Thank you, Adam, for staying with us throughout. I know you also have other commitments and time difference does not make it easy. So really immensely grateful to your support and to your commitment with us. As I highlighted in your introduction, prior to your role in the United Nations, you served in the government of Seychelles in several positions actually. Among these was your role as Minister of Finance, Trade and Blue Economy from 2015 to 2016. Where you negotiated a debt for climate change adaptation swap and launched the process for Seychelles to become the first issuer of a blue bond. So besides Seychelles and Belize, take-up of such instrument has not been very high. In your actually very practical experience, what should international creditors do for small island developing states to increase the use of these instruments? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ali, and good morning to everyone. And congratulations to ESCAP also for having put together this event, which I think is extremely timely, because if we cannot address the issues of debt, then particularly at this time, then we will not be able to address the urgent development needs of emerging economies, excuse me, and in particular, small island developing states. So perhaps firstly, just briefly on the Seychelles experience, and then I will extrapolate from that how we link this in terms of engagement with international creditors for small island developing states more generally. So Seychelles was in a a fairly specific scenario in 2015 when we did the debt for climate adaptation swap. The Seychelles had actually already undertaken a comprehensive debt restructuring exercise in 2010, which was following default, which took place in 2008 following the world financial crisis. And the debt restructuring had involved a large haircut at that time of about 45%. So now by 2015, Seychelles actually had high growth in excess of 5% and was doing very well, and had actually, because of the restructuring, had a very sustainable debt burden in that scenario. But access to additional finance was problematic. The Seychelles has graduated to a high middle income country. It has since become a high income country. And that meant that access to bilateral donors, for example, was very limited. Access to a large number of funds, which was also determined on the basis of GDP per capita, was not available. So there was very limited means to be able to source additional forms of finance. And this is why the debt for climate swap became interesting. Because of the previous debt restructuring, the actual swap remained relatively small. It was around 30 million US dollars. But what was very useful from this swap was that it created a flow of finance which was linked directly towards climate adaptation. And therefore, it allowed also in terms of the budget to dedicate funds for a significant period of time, for 15 years, to climate adaptation, and also linked this to the goals that Seychelles had around the development of the blue economy. Now, this debt swap that took place in 2015, actually, about 3 to 4 months later, Seychelles was actually upgraded by the ratings agency at that time, which was Fitch. This was not solely due, of course, to the debt swap. It was linked to the overall positive performance of the economy, but it then led to interest to proceed in the issuance of a blue bond, and again to raise additional finance to finance Seychelles' priorities in terms of the blue economy. So what I think are very important for creditors to keep in mind, and in terms of dealing with small island developing states and how we can increase the use of these instruments, first is to recognize that there is, in small island developing states, usually a higher vulnerability to external shocks. And therefore, any use of bond markets, for example, and the issuance of blue bonds should factor in this climate risk within the issuance of the bond. And certainly a well-designed blue bond should actually reduce the climate risk over time by focusing efforts, for example, on adaptation. And this should be reflected as well, therefore, in the way in which creditors look at the bond, in that the bond can help actually reduce the risk of the country over time. And we have seen how for small and developing states, climatic events can have a dramatic impact. But if you remove those climatic events, these economies are often very viable. They have built successful models around tourism and a few other sectors, including financial services in many cases. But of course, the narrow economic base does lead to this risk, and it's important to understand this additional risk and link that as well with the risk of climate, but ensuring that the proceeds are properly invested in terms of reducing this risk over time. Second element, which I think we have to keep in mind, is the importance of support from partners. And if we look at more recent bond issuances from Belize, but also we've had Barbados just about 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago. And in both of those cases, the debt for climate adaptation swaps were, in fact, debt buybacks and then reissuances of new bonds. And in both those cases, the new bonds benefited from partial guarantees. In the case of Belize, from the DFC of the US, and in the case of Barbados, from the Inter-American Development Bank. And I think this is going to be one of the key aspects going forward, that particularly for climate vulnerable countries, you can refinance existing debt in a way which is affordable, and you can get significant fiscal space to reinvest in climate resilience, But we need to address the cost of capital, particularly in this current environment. I think a number of previous speakers have spoken about the rising interest rates and the impact that this will have going forward in terms of the ability to mobilize debt for investing in the emergency that is climate change. But the use of appropriate guarantees, and I think that there's been talk as well. I think we heard from Uli and from Shakhtar about the importance perhaps of some sort of guarantee facility, which can then help reduce the risk of investing, particularly in climate vulnerable countries. And then the other point that I will mention is the importance of improving the multilateral approach to debt, and therefore looking at how the mobilization of investment through blue bonds, for example, feeds into country-specific strategies and their growth strategies and their ability, therefore, to build climate resilience over the longer term. And just to briefly conclude on this point, and I think this is where the idea of a sustainable debt coalition that was mentioned by Minister Shireen in the opening remarks around creating an understanding among both creditors and debtors on the critical aspects that will make debt sustainable in the long term. And that includes the economic fundamentals, and it also includes addressing the climate risks in particular, which have a huge bearing on the majority of emerging and developing economies that are extremely vulnerable. And perhaps you could argue that the largest risk that these countries face is associated with climate change. So perhaps to stop there for now, and hopefully I can perhaps follow up with some brief other interventions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. If I may, my team and I can work with you later on to try and have a short case study included in our report based on the practical experience that you were highlighted for the benefit of actually other countries going same down the path. So thank you once again for setting aside time and joining today and sharing very specific experience from practical side. It's not just a theory, you have to actually sitting on the table taking these decisions. So we really value actually your advice and your experiences in this regard. So I might come back to you quickly, but let me just go to the last panelist first, and then I'll come back to you, and then we go in reverse order to Ali and Dr. Akhtar and others who are here. So Professor Devapriya, thank you very much for waiting and listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation so far. You certainly last not the least. We took advantage of you being in the proximity of the region in terms of time difference. That's the only reason we considered you to come in towards the end. We had colleagues speaking literally from 6 different countries. So once again, thank you very much for your patience and staying with us throughout. Professor Devapriya, historically, as you know, external borrowing from both official sources and market sources has been a key financial enabler of fast economic development in Asia. However, it also proved to be a significant risk to macroeconomic stability, especially when developing countries issued foreign currency denominated short-term debt to finance domestic consumption and in some cases, medium to long-term investments and development plans. Are there any alternative options for developing countries to finance their development through less risky channels that you advise they should consider and pursue? And what can the international community do to provide safer and less costly financing options for sustainable development? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamza. I'm audible?
Yes, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate the opportunity to joining this session. I've greatly enjoyed the insightful presentations of my predecessors. Thank you. You see, till now, the discussions had been pretty much focused on the medium-term aspects and also some new innovative initiatives, including the climate finance and etc. But I would like to focus on a set of countries from the Asia-Pacific region, which are the least developed countries, and which, incidentally, your question is applicable to them as well. And some of these countries are now in the process of graduating out from the least developed countries group. I'm talking here on the one end They're the small island states in the Pacific, Solomon Islands in particular, and others. And in the Asia, you have Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Timor-Leste. These are the countries which are in the next 3 to 6 years were supposed to make the transition out from the LDC group. Some of them are already low middle income countries. So the issue is all of a sudden, there in the recent past, particularly in 2021, 22, their post-COVID recovery got interrupted. And as the global recession looms large, their prospect seems to be quite challenging in terms of growth. They are also facing high commodity prices, fuel, food, and also at the same time, the supply chain breakdown because of the sanctions imposed due to Ukraine war is also creating their accessibility issues. What we also see that these countries, very interestingly, quite often got clean sheet from the IMF based on the sustainability, debt sustainability analysis. And all of a sudden, after the Article 4 consultation, within 6 months, they're in deep trouble. If you look at the debt sustainability analysis, most of them has focus, in most cases, it is anchored on the debt GDP ratio, which turned out to be not so a good, dependable indicator for looking at the future as it goes. So let me concentrate on the 4 issues and look what are the solutions for them in the medium term. The first challenge which these countries are facing is what you call the compositional challenge of the foreign finance flow, or the financial public debt situation. What we often ignore that most of the debts of these countries, least developed countries in particular, graduating countries, that the large amount of their debt is domestic borrowing. And domestic borrowing is, and a large part of the revenue also goes in servicing this domestic borrowing. And on the other hand, since they are low middle income countries, they're losing access to concessional grants coming from the bilaterals in particular. So we do have a compositional challenge that although these countries have never failed in servicing their debt, external debt, but at this very moment, they're in a very difficult situation. This has been compounded by their exchange rate risk. Most of these countries in the recent past, particularly in 21-22, they have seen depreciation of the currencies ranging from 20 to 60%. And this exchange rate depreciation is underpinned by growing deficit in balance of payment, trade balances, and definitely current account balance. Current account balance was a bit positive till the other day because of the remittance flow, but both the export prospect and remittance flow and the stop of tourism during the COVID, all these things together has created a serious exchange rate risk. The third risk which they are confronting, and so the solution which is now being talked about in this case is how can these low-income countries, low-middle-income countries graduating from LDCs can ensure a smooth graduation if their exchange and their repayment can be local currency denominated in the future. And that is and how it can be also secure a guarantee or moratorium in the coming months. The third issue is, of course, the exchange rate, the interest rate challenge. As you know, because of the high inflation, both in the country and globally, and also the interest rate is going up, and which is making also a great problem in terms of repayment. And so going for a fixed interest rate is something which being talked about. In between, we are moving away from the LIBOR-based repayment exchange rate fixation to overnight rates. That is something which is yet to be understood, what it actually means in terms of its future repayment as we move forward. The fourth issue, which is more a domestic issue in many ways, is that how this money has been is used within the countries. what we see, a huge overcapitalization of publicly funded projects have taken place. Some of the projects are overvalued, and at the same time, there is a serious mismatch between the flow of returns from these projects and the repayment schedule in that way. So that mismatch is very much there, and how does one really adjust that? Other than rescheduling, is something which is very much out there. So what I'm trying to underscore is we are talking here about not a highly indebted country. We are not talking about a country which is in serious debt distress, but just on the verge of it. What are the preemptive measures which can be put in place globally, regionally, and also within the country, nationally? That is being discussed. Now, the first and foremost issue which is coming to the fore is how to ensure macroeconomic stability, particularly keeping the inflation rate at stabilization or reduction, or at least not to allow it to go up, is one of the key issues over there. The typical suggestion of monetary contraction is not working because the monetary growth did not take place so much during the COVID period. And I will come to that. It is because of the lack of fiscal space. So the typical suggestion coming from IMF or elsewhere that to go for monetary contraction and to do away with critical subsidies, government expenditure review is not very much on the table, because the subsidies which have gone in at this moment are mostly good subsidies, going to the agriculture, fertilizer, food, and at the same time some support for the fuel. That is what is out there. So that's a critical challenge in terms of getting the macro stability in place. The second issue is, of course, the fiscal space issue. The fiscal space, what is being suggested is that how can we ensure the continuation of the flow of ODA or other concessional or semi-concessional finance in these cases. And of course, domestic resource mobilization remains one of the key issues. So all these countries are at this moment facing that classical challenge, doing a trade-off between stabilization and growth. So the point over here is that whether the upcoming Doha conference of the 5th LDC, UN conference on LDCs, will come up with something critical or effective or substantive in order to support these countries to ensure their smooth graduation and resume their interrupted recovery and provide some kind of guarantees and also or moratorium or write-off, if not. So that this, which is very much being discussed. The issue of using new forms of finances, like the climate finance or the green bonds and etc., is very much on the table, but all these countries have somehow, has paused in terms of financing financing the changes in their energy mix, going to renewables or moving out from the fossil fuel. It has been somehow interrupted at this moment. And some of the ODAs are being converted after repayment, had been converted into grant to finance the green growth, which is very much there. But the current very uncertain macroeconomic situation and the global prospect is making all these things very uncertain. And the issue is whether these countries will have the flexibility of using those funds for immediate financing of consumption goods or to sustain some of the ongoing projects as we move forward in the coming months in that way. So what I want to draw attention to this audience is that there are classical cases of debt relief for really highly indebted countries. And there are also countries which are at the same time trying to move into private markets or others to generate new resources. But I'm talking about a set of countries. We are stuck in between. Could have gone to the second round, but at this moment is facing a serious challenge. I think a menu-driven solution for all of them has to come forward in the coming days as we move forward. And your meeting may give us some cue about those. Thank you. I will stop here at this moment.
Thank you, Professor Deb, for bringing up the perspective of LDCs, and especially those who are in the process of graduation and ensuring the transition remains smooth. We have about 25 minutes. What I want to do now is I have actually at least 4 panelists still with me. So if I may go to them one by one with a request to make their final message under 1 minute. Think of it this way: the kind of message you would like to become next day's newspaper headline, the fundamental message for policymakers. One thing, one message in your area of expertise around sustainable debt issues, around debt issues, around sustainable finance aspects, and so on and so forth. But just one message which you think is worth conveying. The reason I'm saying that is because this expert group meeting is sort of a opportunity for us to engage with technical experts on the analytical work, and later on we will distill the key policy messages actually and share them with the member states in our intergovernmental platforms. So we would really like to take those messages all the way to the policymakers. So suppose you want to convey one message to the policymakers, what would that be? I know Jean-Paul has to go. Is that correct, Jean-Paul? You have probably 5 minutes over, I guess.
Yes,
So
if I could go first, that would be ideal. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. You told me your message. Thanks so much. So your minute starts now. Over to you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. I would say, firstly, we need to really address the linkage between debt and climate and the risk that is associated with climate. And linked to that, I would say that we also need to go to a more debtor-friendly environment. At the moment, the rights of creditors are very, very well protected, to the point where I think it actually becomes problematic for the resolution of debt in the longer term, because the protection of the rights of the creditor mean that there is I think Ali previously said that there are countries that are even afraid to upset private creditors, and this actually means sometimes they're not taking the optimal decisions. And so I would go that one of the main things we can do is really have debtor-defined indicators in terms of how they want to invest their funds to create climate resilience. And therefore, I think the adoption of key performance indicators, which are, for example, aligned with nationally determined contributions or with national adaptation plans, that will be one of the best ways to make debt more climate resilient, and also allow debtors to have to give them more agency in the process of dealing with debt, both in terms of new issuances or in refinancing existing debt.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Very clear. Want to explore debt and climate nexus and ensure a debt-friendly environment. Thank you, Jean-Paul. And thanks again. I know you had other commitments and you stayed with us for this long. Really appreciate that. We'll be in touch after the discussion as well.
Thanks so much, Ali.
Thank you. Let me go back to Dr. Akhtar. Dr. Akhtar, what would be your overarching message for our audience today? For 1 minute, what is the one message you think should get to the policymakers around the issue of debt, for instance? Over to you, Dr. Akhtar.
Right. Hamza, we have to, of course, prioritize on how do we focus on debt resolution across the various countries. Now, there is this group of vulnerable 20, and it has substantive debt that needs resolution and settlement. Private creditors comprise about 36% of external debt, remaining with multilaterals. So my take on this is that One, we need to prioritize. Second, we need to recognize that from Asia Pacific region, generally the sense is that there is no major crisis. It's a very prosperous region, but it's a very diversified with a lot of low-income countries, but also emerging markets. And in that actually vulnerable group includes Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Philippines. And I have to say Pakistan's situation is quite precarious. Now, the rule of thumb is that if your debt sustainability analysis is giving you comfort, then you don't have to restructure the debt. And there are two elements to restructure the debt: the solvency test. The other is whether we can actually repay at all or not. And there is this within the we have a FX reserve crisis, which some of these countries have. So designing a common debt framework, which is where I started off, is going to be a challenging task. So my last one sentence is that G20 has to really engage people to come up with additional framework, enhanced framework, including moratorium of a fairly long time, if they are not going to enter into debt cancellation, to be able to now resolve. Otherwise, there is this famous saying, too little and too late. And that's where we are right now.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar. Importance of prioritization of vulnerable countries in the region, and importance of recognizing actually that not everybody in the same boat. And there are several countries over here. We will certainly try and highlight this message in our report, in our work. Back to you, Ali. I interrupted you. You had one more fundamental message on your last slide. You can mention that, or any other overarching message you would like to share. You have heard people, colleagues, commenting on DSA one way or the other, and some related issues, solvency versus liquidity and those aspects. So you can touch upon that. Over to you.
Thank you, Hamza. And it was good to hear Dr. Akhtar's comments as well, on point. Let me start by making an umbrella comment, which is that the shocks that that the world is facing today, both in terms of elevated commodity prices and tightening global financial conditions, in these circumstances, emerging markets, low-income countries should not take macroeconomic stability for granted. And if there were plans that predated the current environment, those plans may need to be, rephased or adjusted a little bit to make sure that macroeconomic stability is not sacrificed or compromised. Because if that happens, then all of those plans for investment, etc., would be derailed. So that's just an overarching message. Now, within that, to deliver that, it's important to conserve fiscal space and not expand fiscal space on untargeted subsidies, whether they be on fuel or other items. Even not all food subsidies are targeted in countries. So I think as the stresses of these external crises grow, it will be important for countries to look at how they can improve the efficiency of their spending and avoid regressive subsidy spending in particular. My third point is conserve financing, which is related to, again, maintaining macroeconomic stability, preventing the occurrence of a debt crisis means that you conserve the financing that you have. If you are receiving financing from international financial institutions, make sure it is not being expended on paying out private creditors, that your engagement with private creditors is maintained. The fund has precautionary facilities, which some of these countries, not sure, there's the FCL, which is perhaps for more upper end emerging markets, but there is also the PLL, the precautionary facility which is accessible. And if countries wanted to access these facilities, they should come early rather than late when problems have already surfaced. I think the international financial architecture, the architecture for sovereign debt resolutions, um, has evolved over the last several years. There have been improvements in the private creditor space, but there are still, efforts that are needed to strengthen the creditor-creditor engagement in the official sector space, including in the context of the common framework. But I think some of the ideas that are shared here, including by Dr. Akhtar, are interesting, and it would be up to the international community, including the G20, to pursue them. With regard to the fund, because of its role in the debt sustainability analysis, its role as crisis lender, um, its role also as heavily involved in the architecture for sovereign debt resolutions. We have a stake in this. We are very closely involved in this. We have worked to improve our frameworks, especially on debt sustainability, and we hope that these new frameworks will serve the community, the international community, well. Thank you, Hamza, again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ali, for succinctly wrapping up and very clear advice for our member states. As I said to the panelists, we'll remain engaged with you. We'll share once we complete our research for further feedback from your expertise and from colleagues from IMF, because we're touching upon issues which actually are primarily the domain of IMF. So thank you very much once again for setting aside time. Stay with us. We have another 5-10 minutes if you want to listen in. Professor Zaib, you came in the end, so I'll give you a little bit more time if you want. But I want to conclude by talking about slightly broader issues and touch it with the sustainable finance angle a bit more. So at the recently released Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, it calls for MDB shareholders to reform MDB practices and priorities and to define a new vision and operational model, channels, and instruments that are fit for addressing climate emergency, right? So what are your insights? What's your advice? What would you like to highlight the aspects that you think are crucial for Asia-Pacific countries in this regard?
Thank you very much. We have noted that, and most of the countries which I have been talking about, starting from Solomon Islands to Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, Laos, all these are climate-affected countries. So Sharm el-Sheikh's outcome has important implications for these countries. The important point over here is that how can one use your practices when you are in a transition or in stressful situation over here. So the issue is how can we use these kind of climate-related financing possibilities for not only stabilizing the country, but also two other things. One is to finance the, much deferred domestic reforms which were supposed to come, whether it is in the tax mobilization or improving effectiveness of public expenditure, or having a much more sustainable way of financing the fiscal deficit. So that would be one, how to relate those new forms of finances if they at all come through. That is one. The other part of the whole situation is that the situation is going to aggravate for these graduating LDCs in particular, when they lose the privileged market access, the special preferences given to them. So, so how to really keep the real economy going and relate those finances to export diversification or improving labor productivity, all those issues. And the third point, of course, is that how to target them to ameliorate the condition of the left behind population. Climate affected people, if you look at that, is always facing multiple vulnerabilities. It is not only the climate, but they're also income poor. They have limited access to health and education services. And there are other, locational challenges for this country, this group of people. So taking a much more disaggregated view by these finances will be very, very critical, particularly using the SDG framework in these cases. So my basic point is that new forms of finances are very welcome. As fast as they come is much better, but they have to be integrated into the overall framework of macroeconomic stabilization, unattended reforms to finance the reform measures, and also reaching out to the most deprived section of the economy, of the population, to the left behind, and some of them have been pushed behind during the COVID, and also finance that post-COVID recovery. That would be my point. And the international support measures, it has to be somehow, it has to be in consonance with these new measures, potential measures which we are talking about. The good part of these countries is that they don't have many private creditors. Many of them, most of them had been multilateral organizations. More than 50–60% of the debts are with them. So they will have to come forward in terms of at least putting in a moratorium and having a long-term schedule for that repayment, of course. Most of the countries as of today did not ask for debt write-off, but it has been put into a difficult situation, which may lead into that kind of extreme circumstances. So this is the time to act in order to keep the numbers of highly indebted countries under control as we move. So I look forward for a much more larger substantive package, much more integrated one, along with the stabilization and keeping the real economy going, creating employment and income for the left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dev. I think that really your last observation, the setup of loss and damage fund at the COP27 is, I think, a good step in that direction. Hopefully, it will become operational and much more effective down the line. Let me open the floor for a quick question. I still have actually Dr. Akhtar, Ali from IMF, and Professor Dev here with me. So anybody from the audience here who's here in person would like to ask any question, and if you can identify your question, your panelists you would like to ask to, that would be great. Yes, go ahead, Alberto.
Thank you very much. Very interesting panel. Very a lot of food for thought for us. I would like to ask this question to Deb Priya. Nice to see you again, by the way. There was a lot of discussion about loss and damage lately in the COP27, and as Hamza just mentioned, and the operationalization is still not clear. But clearly, I mean, this is a quite important topic, for small island developing states. And to me, I mean, the connection between loss and damage and investment in resilience should be key, right? Because it's not just a matter of paying for damage, but also trying to find ways to construct better. So I would like to, if you have some reflections on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Alberto. Professor Dev, what are the likelihood of success of the loss and damage fund, and how the money there channel for investments? That's the question, right? Yeah.
The Sharm el-Sheikh outcome has highlighted this is one of the rare, deliverables which has come through, and it has been well received by the concerned countries, particularly the affected countries in that way. But the first of all, the operational modalities are not yet clear. It's the same thing which applies on the earlier promised $100 billion issues. So it is not very clear. And what is also not very clear for us, the potential recipient, is that how much it will be earmarked for sectors or for groups, or how it will be, what will be the terms and conditions in which it will be coming through as a grant or as a concessional loan, and whether it will also require key performance indicators attached to it, to that. And what is also not very clear, that whether this will also have counter, what you call is the matching performance indicators on the part of the major polluters, both in the region and globally. So whilst we rejoice the creation of the fund, most of the countries are in a suspended animation at this moment to see how it really works out in the immediate future. One of the most important point for all these countries is that 2023-2024 would be very, very critical period for most of these countries. Whether this fund will come in operation to ameliorate some of the challenges of 2022-2023, that is something to be seen. So will there be enough political commitment, political goodwill, or political traction to take these things fund forward, particularly given the global circumstances, given the looming recession, the war going on, and also the high inflation in some of the major developed countries as it is there. So we are not still out of the wood. Let's see how it progresses. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zaid. I have several questions here with me and one actually from online as well. Let me at least take one question. So I know we only have 5 minutes left, but let me at least take one question which is a bit broad and several aspects can be discussed in that question. Is addressed to either Dr. Akhtar or Ali because it relates to debt. The question is from Mai. I cannot read APMDD, so we cannot identify the speaker, but it's from Philippines. So as you know, domestic debt are outpacing external debt in many countries, as is the case with Philippines. What are the major risks involved here and what can be done? A broad question, so several aspects can be addressed here. Ali or Dr. Akhtar, whoever wants to go first, or you both want to go, take it.
I can, I can come in first. So domestic debt is good in that domestic is could be defined according to 3 criteria. It could be currency, whether it's local currency or foreign currency. It could be by residency, whether it's locally held by residents or by non-residents. If it's local residents that hold it, then it's domestic. And the third is jurisdiction, whether the debt is issued under domestic law or foreign law. Now, in general, you'll find that those 3 things intersect, that it's local currency, locally held and issued under domestic law, but it's not necessary, and it's important to know that. Now, typically, if a country has all of its currency, its debt in the local currency, then the likelihood of what is called a legal default is small, is low, because you can always print your currency to pay off your obligations. You can inflate its value away. However, in practice, it's not so easy because a lot of this debt can be held by the banking system, and if you inflict losses on the banking system, it can circle back onto the government. And so it is in these circumstances, it is important for the sovereign to take account of the impact of any measures, whether it's a reprofiling of this debt or rescheduling, or if there are options being explored in this space, then the consequences for financial stability need to be very carefully weighed. And I think stress testing of banks, what kind of losses they would face, and then protecting banks against those would be important. However, it is also becoming increasingly difficult to totally carve out domestic creditors when countries need to, restructure their debts, because external private creditors demand that domestic creditors also contribute. And in many cases, the interest rates that are earned by domestic creditors are quite large, quite high. And so there is an expectation that these creditors would also contribute. It's a complex issue, and I think it would be wise for countries, especially if they feel that they are approaching debt difficulties, to plan early in respect of domestic debt, develop contingency plans, etc., on what could be done exactly. in a situation where debt has to be restructured. I'll just pause here. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. This was a question from Mai Buan Ventura from Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. Thank you very much for highlighting the point that domestic and external debt are not fundamentally separate. Actually, the developments in both aspects end up having an overall impact on your debt sustainability. I have 1 more minute and in my watch, and I have one last question probably I can ask, which is a little more general. So again, Dr. Akhtar, Professor Deb, or Ali can answer that. While debt financing is the preferred instrument of choice by most international and domestic investors, what can be done to increase the adoption of longer-term financing instruments, including equity?
Okay.
Go ahead, Dr. Akhtar.
Okay, this is my favorite question and advocacy that I do. I'm currently the chairperson of PSX, and I have argued very strongly that the governments often have a bias to be really moving the financial system to a bank-based system, which eventually hurts everybody at the end of the day. And the bank-based system has so many distortions. For one, central banks that are facing issues of very high level of easing, the monetary easing that have happened, have actually, the banks have ended up accessing more and more refinancing below the policy rates that were, and these were schemes that had been designed to lift the recovery during the COVID period. It's been so damaging because it has impacted the sectoral kind of direction in which the flow of the banking sector credit flow has moved. The second point is that, you know, none of these governments in Asia have really made a sincere effort to really expand their stock markets. It may be unfair because some of the markets are about 128% of GDP, but when they have choice, they would much rather go and tap the banks. For instance, if we are facing contingent liabilities, then those banks, then the government would go to raise debt and offer guarantees to the banking system. But they would not go to the equity market, which is a marketplace, and it has a better clearing system, in my view. And if we really have broadening and deepening of the capital markets, and we had a session on ESG financing a while back, and if we really promoted ESG financing, then some of these debt issues would be diffused somewhat. We are talking about the domestic credit. We should be talking about the domestic capital markets being tapped effectively so that both the public government, public sector, and private sector can get more IPOs listed and are able to even privatize their failed institutions at the end of the day. So I think it's a great topic for you, Hamza. You should look at it. And there are some very good capital markets in Asian continent. Over to you, Hamza.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar. I think this is one of the issues we are touching upon in our sustainable finance report that I was referring to. So one of the chapters touches upon importance of developing domestic capital markets actually as a base for not only long-term development financing, but including ESG investments and other sustainable finance instruments. So thank you, Dr. Akhtar. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Professor Deb, for staying with us throughout this session. I also thank other panelists who juggled their commitments from different time zones and so on and so forth, and share this perspective with us. We'll prepare a snapshot of discussions today once the whole thing is done, which is about a week to go from here. And then we'll share those with you as well. And later on, when we finalize the research, which will be towards end of March, we'll again try and share the draft version before that for you to have a look. And then if any other insights you think is worth highlighting there, we'll try and do that. Then, as some of you already know, especially Dr. Rakhta, we engage with policymakers after we publish our research. So we'll be engaging with some of you in organizing policy dialogues at the country level to take some of the message to the policymakers, as I said, and have further specific discussions once the research is done. So on behalf of my team, which have been working tirelessly for several weeks in not only prepare the draft of the report itself, but in planning and organizing this particular event, I thank you all, and have a productive rest of the week, and I'll see you guys around. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ali. It was very
Thank you,
instrumental
Hamza.
to hear you out. All the best.
Bye-bye.